Good evening, everyone. Hi. So many smiling faces. You all found us. Even working here, this is one of the first times I've ever been in this building, so I'm impressed that you all found us tonight. Just a few housekeeping things to get started with. There are a lot of people here to talk tonight who have a lot of information that is worth hearing about, and I don't want to take up any of their time. So some of the big things to make note of, we have our refreshments over here to your left side of the room, so make sure to help yourselves. Bathrooms right outside of this door and to your right, so they're close by on this. For any of you who had friends or family who wanted to attend and were unable to do so, we will have this the Facebook group part of that. Otherwise, you're welcome. For those of you who are seated at our tables, you will notice that there are a plethora of QR codes. For the ones that are laminated on the sheets, those are just different resources that vary by profession, and then some of them are just overall excellent resources for anyone who works with LGBTQ plus identifying patients. So you can scan those with your phone, and then of course I have my final evaluation after the fact. So I would love to hear your thoughts about tonight, because this is just one of the first trainings that I am hosting regarding our clinical consideration. Maybe. Always the technical difficulties. It definitely didn't need to be turned on. Okay. So now we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to go ahead and just do a quick shout out for everyone who made this event possible tonight. There were a lot of people who helped out behind the scenes, but between the health sciences department, social sciences and liberal arts, and a slew of people who work with the event coordination here on campus, I really couldn't have put this passion project to life. So if you're part of any of these groups, I thank you, and we'll give them a quick round of applause. It's definitely on this time. Okay. So speaking of, the first industry expert who we have speaking with us tonight is Dr. Aaron Bachhofer. Aaron Bachhofer is a tenured professor of history at Rose State College, a position he has held since 2008. He has also served 6 years as the Associate Dean of the Social Sciences Division. Dr. Bachhofer received his PhD from Oklahoma State University in 2006, where he specialized in American history, modern Europe, and the history of sex and gender in the United States. His professional interests include LGBTQ plus activism, American social and cultural theory, and historical research methodologies. Dr. Bachhofer serves as Rose State College's in a number of capacities, related to curriculum development, assessment, and as the faculty sponsor for the Rose State College Spectrum Alliance. So without further ado, we will go ahead and let him give us a little bit of what he's got to offer.
Well, let me make sure it's on. Okay, good. First of all, welcome. I want to thank a couple of people specifically. a big shout out to Dr. Rita Mild, who is the Dean of the Health Sciences Center. She is responsible for the refreshments and is just an utterly fabulous human being. Hello, Dr. Mild. I also want to reach out and say hello to Dr. Ortiz, Dr. Juanita Ortiz. She has a new position on campus. She is the Executive Director of Institutional Advancement and Research, but she is a passionate advocate for these sorts of issues as well. So she's here. Hello, Dr. Ortiz. And otherwise, I want to thank you for coming out. I know that this is a Thursday night, and it's sometimes hard to get here and find this place. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to start off with a quick story. If you have ever tried to get a PhD in history, you know that one of the key things you have to do is write a book, essentially a dissertation. And I remember vividly that I needed a topic for my dissertation, and I had a very wonderful, cool guy at Oklahoma State who was encouraging me to write about the history of cattle in Oklahoma. And he was very near retirement, luckily. And I said, you know, Joe, I think I have something else I might like to write about. What about the queer subculture in Oklahoma City from, say, 1889 to the present? Now, Joe was extremely conservative, and he sort of looked off, and I know what he was thinking. I don't have to sit and listen to this, so I don't care. And he said, sure, go for it. And it was fantastic. He was very supportive. But in the process of doing that, you have to take your presentation materials around to each of the members of your committee, and they have to, of course, look it over and give you some feedback. And everyone was very gung-ho. Yeah, this will be fantastic. And I went to someone who was on my committee that I really thought would be a valuable resource and excited. And this individual, despite being at a Division I research institution, said, well, I don't think you'll find any material. Everybody knows there weren't any gay people in Oklahoma before 1969. And I started laughing because I thought that this individual was pulling my leg. And then I realized, no, they're not. They honestly believe that. So it made me dig even deeper and figured that this was something that needed to be talked about. So I've specialized in the history of LGBTQ plus issues in Oklahoma and the United States generally for quite a while. And I've been lucky to have administrators and other people at this institution who've supported me in my work. And so this is a little snippet of it. We're going to go through it very quickly. And if you maybe have any questions later, I'll field them, but forgive me for the speed of this. There's this belief, I think, of the individual I spoke to you about that LGBTQ plus folks are a rather modern species, a modern phenomenon. Actually, the historical record is replete with examples of people who were exhibiting non-binary gender attitudes and beliefs, and certainly same-sex sexuality in ancient times, of course. But in the case of the United States, even in colonial America, you saw examples of men and women living with people who were also men and women, and the community at that time not really knowing what to do with that. They didn't know how to characterize it or classify it. And of course, this was before a person's sexuality was really a functional part of their core personal identity. So it was really more a matter of folks not knowing what to do with that, not understanding. And there were plenty of opportunities for people. As a matter of fact, if we're Indigenous Americans and Two-Spirit people, there are many examples of what we would probably consider at this point a general and complete turning on its head, if you will, of gender norms in what would be considered Western European societies. These are examples of two-spirited peoples in the Blackfoot tribe, I believe. These were people who, they weren't male, they weren't female, they occupied a third gender status. They were important in their tribes for ceremonial reasons, particularly whenever it came to peacemaking and treaty making and stuff like that. There are examples. This is probably one of the more famous two-spirit people of the Zuni tribe, a person named Quihue, who was the first indigenous person to ever meet the president of the United States. So that Quihue occupied a very specialized and important role in the Zuni tribe, as history shows. There were also examples of other Plains groups, right? Yes, I did. Here's a Plains group, the Crow. Not only are these folks, they were viewed among missionaries and other colonial residents with a great deal of distrust, and in some cases, just outright anger and shame, because they didn't understand what these gender roles and sex roles were completely out of the norm from what they had personally experienced in their Western European and Christian traditions. So it's no doubt, no wonder that they were treated in the literature in negative ways. But the fact that this third way, as it's often called, or two-spirit way, is still a revered member in Native American groups in the United States now is a testament to the longevity of this particular construction. As a matter of fact, I think there are only 2 indigenous groups in North America that don't have some kind of third gender presentation in their society. Same-sex and gender nonconformity in the Victorian period these are a little bit easier to trace for us, because middle-class white Victorians were nothing if not obsessive compulsive about writing things down. So we have tons and tons of literature and diaries and photographs. These are a couple of great photographs of couples. These were, the paraphrase or the way maybe to conceive of this would be that in an era when folks were somewhat reticent about talking about sex and gender issues in public, these were examples of people who definitely lived what we might say non-binary, non-normative sexual and gender lives. And they did this pretty much out in the open. I mean, and a lot of it it had to do with the fact that people didn't have the vocabulary at this point to describe it or to understand it. There are plenty of examples of what we would now consider, I think, clearly marriages, relationships between people that were loving and supportive, and in every way a marriage by a modern sense of the word. And there are plenty of these examples in the historical record, thanks to these folks and their obsessive need to write things down. Now, I will say, unfortunately, this is true for middle-class Americans, but working-class Americans at this point, not quite so much. And that's simply because, as someone told me once, they were working. They didn't have time to write. So there you go. But there were examples of these sorts of relationships very early on. And some of them are of rather famous individuals. I don't know if you're aware, but Abraham Lincoln had a 7-year relationship with another man named Joshua Fry Speed that was probably homosocial at the very least, and possibly homosexual. Some people don't like to hear about that or talk about it because of the status that Lincoln has accrued over the years. One of the things that is a large change in LGBTQ plus studies, and certainly in LGBTQ plus history, is this concept of sexology. There is a massive change in the way people identify the medical profession, both themselves and people within it, starting in the 1870s. And a lot of it has to do, leave it to the Germans and the Austrians. The German and Austrian Psychiatric Association were very, very cognizant of trying to identify and basically make a name for their theories and make a name for their discipline. So as a result, they went out of their way to classify and taxonomy, if that's a word, different levels of what they perceive to be psychiatric difference and psychiatric malformation. This is this happens very, very quickly. As a matter of fact, people like Richard Graf von Ebing and Carl Westphal. Westphal is responsible for being the first individual to ever use the phrase contrary sexual feeling in a paper in 1870, where he's discussing one of his patients who is not what we would consider heterosexual. The word homosexual is created at this point by Graf von Ebing, who notes in many of his patients that they seem to have what he called a peculiar sexual and emotional attachment to members of the same sex. This guy, so those of you who are aficionados of psychology will probably recognize Sigmund Freud. He of the creation of psychotherapy and the use of cocaine as a stimulant, will probably do more to advance the cause for LGBTQ identification than any other single sexologist in this era. He is the first person to say a person's sexuality, homosexuality in particular, is just a phase in your psychosocial development. It's not abnormal at all. Now, you might quibble on whether or not staying in the homosexual phase is abnormal or not. So he's a little problematic by our standards now. But Freud and these other men are essentially carving out an existence for themselves. And that's a great thing for many LGBTQ people who had no idea how to describe their feelings. You know, now I understand I am a homosexual, I am a heterosexual, I am bisexual. Of course, that came with a cost. Whenever something can be taxonified and discussed, it can be identified, it can be treated. As a matter of fact, one of the first things these gentlemen will do is describe LGBTQ people as malformed and maladjusted, and that they are in need of treatment. And as a result, they carve out a nice little cottage industry for themselves that continues in some cases to this day. However, LGBTQ people didn't just sit on their hands. Many of them got out and decided to try and find other people like them or who liked the things that they liked. And in cases of, like in New York City, Philadelphia, there were enclaves, bars, speakeasies, places where people knew they could go and meet up with other people who shared their ideas about sex and gender and feel some degree of camaraderie away from prying eyes, but at the same time within a degree of normalcy in public that was absolutely unprecedented. Well, there we go. Funny thing, we had a war. I don't know if you heard of it, World War II, and we won. Whew. I'm sorry if I gave that away if you haven't read the book. We won. World War II is arguably the most important political, social, and economic event of the 20th century. This country, the world, will never be the same because of what went on during World War II. In the case of LGBTQ people, nothing, underline that 10 times. The military, of course, had never allowed LGBTQ plus people to serve openly. But during the war, we found out some things. Apparently, queer people are really smart. And some of them have skills, translation skills, language skills, knowledge of electronics and data and radar, fill in the blank, that were extremely useful. So the government started turning a blind eye to what was clearly homosexual and lesbian recruits that were being brought in. And these people served absolutely admirably. And they received a great deal of commendation from their superior officers. And for a while, for the first 3 or 4 years of the war, served relatively openly. As we like to say, though, all good things must come to an end, right? And of course, that thing that comes to an end nationally is McCarthyism. It's hard in our era today to really put a finger on this notion of what 100% Americanism looked like or sounded like. This was a period where men who had nefarious designs on power, people like Joseph McCarthy, went out of their way to target people simply because they were communist. Simply because they had supported their queer colleagues at work, simply because they had, said something reasonably negative about the government. I don't know. This was not the era in which to do that. Okay, this was a period where the Americans are competing with the Soviets in the Cold War, and they are extremely, extremely concerned about anything that doesn't look right, sound like, act right. And as a result, LGBTQ Americans found themselves in a great deal of trouble at this point. As a matter of fact, thousands of Americans will be fired from the State Department because they are now classified as security risks. They will be dismissed from the military with what were called blue discharges, or they will be given F4 deferments to begin with. It was a very chilling effect. It caused people to retreat back into the closet and to some of those gains that had been made were starting to recede a bit. Oklahoma was certainly not beyond this as well. We had our own version of McCarthyism. Oklahoma County Attorney Curtis Harris was elected in the 1960s, 1964. Harris was probably one of the meanest human beings who ever lived. There's just no easy way to say that. I'm sorry if anyone in here is related to him, but he made it his mission to go after all forms of what he considered to be out of the norm of acceptability. And LGBTQ residents in Oklahoma City were one of his favorite targets. He personally led raids on establishments and things. He personally went after people, used his own investigators. All of this is unheard of in the modern era, but he took it to new heights. So even in Oklahoma City, the relative openness began to recede rather quickly. Am I just not pointing this in the right area? Okay. Oh, all right. Well, the 50s also saw, though, a lot of courage by people internationally and nationally in this movement. In California in 1951, a group of men led by Harry Hay and Rudy Gernreich established the Mattachine Society. The Mattachine Society was arguably the first official gay rights organization in the United States. It was designed to educate people about issues that homosexual men faced and what could be done to help alleviate their concerns. It was extremely controversial, especially by the fact they sent much of their materials through the mail, which was a felony at that point. Not good at all, but they risked a lot to get that started. Women started a group called the Daughters of Bilitis. They had a publication called The Ladder, which was, again, absolutely groundbreaking. And it was dedicated specifically not only to the needs that lesbian women faced in terms of their sexuality, but also the issues that related to their gender that women faced at all points, like trying to find jobs, trying to find housing, medical care, the whole 9 yards in that regard. These are early 1950s. These groups are doing things that are illegal. It was illegal to be homosexual in the United States before 1970, and it was illegal to send information about this through the mail. There were other forms of people being very courageous. This is Christine Jorgensen is maybe the most famous trans person before Caitlyn Jenner, unfortunately, in the modern era. And Christine Jorgensen was born George Jorgensen and was a military hero during World War II. The United States became fascinated with Christine's affirmation into Christine, and she was very honest and open about her process and her personal life. And the LA Mirror and others ran articles like this, and Americans were sympathetic and somewhat beholden to her and very interested in her story, mainly because this is an era when science is king and people are thinking, well, what if she's telling the truth? What if she really is a woman trapped in a man's body? This would be horrific. And so she starts to get a lot of publicity, and trans people everywhere look to her and her process and the heroism that she shows. Frank Kameny, PhD in astronomy, was dismissed from his job simply because he was gay. He fought for the rest of his life to try and have his credentials reestablished, and he is a founding father, so to speak, in the homophile movement. All of these people have FBI files on them that are pretty thick that you can access now. This was extremely dangerous, and people not only risked their lives, but certainly their retirements, their jobs. It was a very chilling time in the United States. Oh shoot. There we go. Well, we can all sit back and thank Earl Warren for letting us out of the closet, so to speak. Earl Warren was Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Eisenhower appointed him in 57 and said it was the best damn fool mistake I ever made, because even though he was relatively conservative, he was also very, very fair. And he made some important rulings that will impact the LGBTQ community and Americans everywhere. First of all, obscenity is in the eye of the beholder. In Griswold versus Connecticut, it is no longer illegal to send information about birth control through the mail. Your idea of what's offensive might not be what my idea of offensive is. And so in other words, the First Amendment matters. He reminded us of that from his perch as Chief Justice. Also, Newsweek, New York Times, Life magazine started running stories on LGBTQ Americans. Some of them weren't terribly flattering, but as some people would say, There's no such thing as bad publicity. It at least brought forth some of the issues that many people had been facing and fielding at this point in the United States. Quickly, there were folks in Oklahoma too that showed a great deal of courage as well. There was a club in Oklahoma City called the Inferno. It was literally located on the border between Cleveland County and Oklahoma County. And they got papers from both counties. So whenever authorities would come to raid them, if they were from Oklahoma County, they'd say, oh, we're from Cleveland County. We're in Cleveland, and vice versa. Very, very clever. Great drag shows there too. Tony Sinclair and Gil Ray and others. The Mayflower, which was a club, Mayflower Lounge, located on the corner of 23rd and Classen in Oklahoma City next to the Mayflower Theater, was arguably the most well-known gay club in Oklahoma City in the early 1960s. When it burned down, Johnny Carson mentioned it on The Tonight Show because it had become a regional institution. This man here, Arnold Lee Smith, opened a club in Paseo in 1963 called Lee's Lounge. Curtis Harris had him arrested every day, and Arnold bailed himself out, went back and opened the club, giving Curtis the business, I guess you could say, every day. And he did that for years. Why? Because he said gay people need a place to go in Oklahoma City, and it wasn't fair. That's courage. That is activism. It may not be conventional activism, but it is definitely activism. Well, we're all familiar probably with the Stonewall Rebellion from June of '69. This is often considered the harbinger of the modern gay rights movement. Just a little bit of history there. This club, which was owned by the mafia, had been targeted by the police for quite some time. It's on Christopher Street in the Greenwich Village area. One night, the inevitable happened. The police came, they roughed some people up, tried to take them downtown. And as they say, that's when the fight started. People had enough. They weren't going to take it anymore. They assaulted the police, and the riots that ensued for the next 3 days tended to be identified clearly as a change in the way people perceive politics, identity politics in the United States. You'll see very clearly here, within days and within weeks of the other, there are the Gay Liberation Front, Gay Activist Alliance. The pressure that is put on institutions starts to see meteoric change. The American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality as a disorder from their statistical manual in 1973. Gay pride marches all over the place, including Oklahoma City, and anti-discrimination ordinances across the country too, that you cannot attack people simply because you don't agree with their sexual or gender identity. And then AIDS. 1981, a cancer that is normally found in elderly Americans started appearing regularly in young, otherwise healthy men in California and New York primarily. It was understood that the only thing these gentlemen had in common was that they were gay, or they were intravenous drug users and gay. So it quickly became known as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, or the gay plague, whatnot. All of that politicalization, all of that ended because they did not have any support at all. Ronald Reagan did not say the word AIDS publicly until 1985, when this was well beyond being in control. I mean, this was a public health crisis, and it was ignored and treated like a moral issue, as if AIDS discriminated against, heterosexuals in any case. 35 million people have died worldwide of AIDS for a disease that is at least significantly preventable. Also, this was a chilling effect in politics in the United States. The Supreme Court in 1986, Bowers versus Hardwick, said you can discriminate against gay and bisexual men and women. You, the state, if it has an interest, can control the sexuality of gay men and women. Essentially, they outlawed sodomy for straight people, but kept it in place for gay people. Well, Bill Clinton came along, and a lot of people had some high hopes for him. He was young, he said the right things, and he was dedicated to doing several things. I will help end the AIDS crisis. I will desegregate the military in terms of sexuality, and I will also bring gay marriage to the United States of America. And he did one of those things. I feel your pain. You've heard that probably 1,000 times from Bill Clinton. It came in response to AIDS activists who decried the fact that the first Bush administration and Reagan administration didn't really give a lot to the movement in terms of money or research. So Bill Clinton became arguably the most important president for HIV and AIDS education and funding, and he really stepped up to the plate in regard to that. The other issues, not so much. We've all heard of don't ask, don't tell. Instead of integrating the military, we developed a compromise, as he called it, which turned out to be a morass of stupidity, where it was okay to be gay or lesbian in the military. You just can't tell anybody about it. Yeah, nothing wrong with that, huh? Also, the Defense of Marriage Act. This clearly violated the Constitution, but he signed it into law anyway. It allowed the federal government to see two things. First, marriage is between a man and a woman. And second, states are not required to accept marriages as legal from other institutions, other municipalities, other states. Clearly violation of the 14th Amendment. But as they say, he signed it anyway because he's pandering to a larger base at that point. In Oklahoma, State Question 711 passed in 2004 on the crest of these, which basically said in the Oklahoma Constitution that marriage is between a man and a woman. Well, this thing either works or it doesn't work. Okay, I'm going to say I don't want to eat up more time. I'm going to end up as quickly as I can. The change in the last 10 to 15 years, however, has been meteoric in terms of the visibility and acceptance of LGBTQ people in the United States. I put these statistics up here to shock you, and I hope they do. In 2004, 60% of Americans disapproved of the concept of marriage equality. By 2019, 61% approved. Part of this is related to what's called the contact hypothesis. People already knew you and thought you were fantastic and wonderful. Then they found out you were gay or lesbian or bi or trans and went, oh, I guess that really doesn't matter then. Yeah. 75% of Americans now approve of some kind of judicial guarantee of LGBTQ rights, whether it be employment rights, family rights, or rights related to hate crimes protection. And 50% of states in the United States have some kind of codified non-discrimination statutes at the state level. This is easily the most significant social transformation in modern world history. Why it happened, there are a number of debates. I would point to the fact that LGBTQ folks are much more visible now than they've ever been before, the contact hypothesis. And a lot of it has to do with younger people. They simply were not raised with some of those ideas and stereotypes that have to be unlearned, I guess you could say. Yeah. Well, the Supreme Court of the United States jumped on this change, and to give them credit, I think sometimes the Supreme Court takes it on the chin because it's always seen as the sum of the justices that are there individually. But I have often found that together, they get it right more often than they get it wrong. And I would point to three cases in particular: Lawrence versus Texas, which overrode the Bowers decision. Apparently, the First Amendment matters, and you can't tell people what private conduct is really like as long as they're not invading public space. Second, US versus Windsor. The Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional. The Due Process Clause clearly indicates that any law that is legal in one state has to be honored in another state. That's why this federal system works. And then maybe the biggest one of all, Obergefell versus Hodges, marriage equality is a constitutional right. And a funny thing happened. Gay people started getting married. The world didn't end. Heterosexual marriages didn't stop or didn't decrease in vitality or importance or whatever it happens to be. This was an eye-opener for a lot of Americans. All the boogeymen that they'd been told all those years, it never came true. So this was a pretty good moment. And it's indicative of what our institutions in government can do and should do, where they teach Americans, they lead Americans, and they show us the way. Well, quickly to end up, Oklahoma, we have Oklahoma is often labeled and thought of as being a very conservative place. And overall, I think it is on most matters. But we have been, in some cases, at the forefront of LGBTQ history. As a matter of fact, the Oklahomans for Equality, this organization has been around in either this incantation or the Oklahomans for Human Rights for almost 40 years. And they have done great work for people all across the spectrum. We have elected LGBTQ plus people to office. Jim Roth became the first member of the Oklahoma County Commissioners to be openly gay. Al McCaffrey was elected to the Senate and the House of Representatives for Oklahoma too. James Cooper, currently on the Oklahoma City Council, is the first member of that body openly gay. And then this last year, we sent Mari Turner to the Oklahoma House of Representatives. She is the first Muslim and first non-binary person identifies as queer in the Oklahoma legislature. All of this is fantastic. As a matter of fact, last month, the State Department of Health changed the gender designation on a person's birth certificate to represent their newfound status as an intermediate gender. And the governor immediately said that he would try and fight that. But so in many ways, we've come a long way. I would, however, point some things out to you, and it's something you should all remember. First, we don't have any statewide protections for people who are LGBTQ plus. We just don't. Not employment, not gender. We have none of that, nothing. Second, we have no hate crimes law, race, gender, sex, sexual identity. So there is literally no value taken or no value added when people commit what in any other institution or any other municipality might be considered a hate crime because of a person's gender and sexuality or whatnot. Third, conversion therapy is still alive and well in Oklahoma. You're welcome. Yeah. And fourth, this session alone, there were 10 bills that were introduced that specifically targeted trans Oklahomans. And it was everything from, they were going to make it a felony to seek out healthcare if you were trans, a felony to teach students in a classroom setting about any of this stuff. Yeah, most of these died in committee. They never come to light because there are good, solid people in the legislature who make sure that they don't come to light. But to me, it's about intent. People intended for this to happen. And these are people who go home to their kids, go home to their constituents and parrot this stuff out. So we have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go in Oklahoma. I would leave you with three things. LGBTQ plus Americans have always been here. They have always been targeted and they've always fought back. For those of you who are on the front lines of the medical profession, keep some of this in mind maybe as you deal with patients, because what you might see as reticence or what you might see as somebody not telling you the whole story, it may have more to do with how they were raised or the environment they were raised in than trying to maybe not give you the information you may want or need as a caregiver. Thank you very much for your attention. You.
All right. Well, I certainly didn't get my speaking skills from him, but that's okay. So we're going to go ahead and kind of switch gears here. And just to kind of get an idea of our audience, of course, this was targeted for healthcare professionals. Can I get a show of hands of those who are currently practicing at bedside right now with patients, regardless of your field? Okay. Students. People who are here to learn, just starting their career perhaps. Wonderful. The scrubs didn't give it away. Wonderful. Well, we are going to go ahead and swap out the clicker, so no worries there. But I would like to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. He is somebody very near and dear to my heart. I'm very excited to hear from him today. Thank you. Perfect. So next we will hear from Russell or Rusty Rooms. Rusty is the owner and lead nurse practitioner of Diversity Family Health. As you can see, the booth in the back. It is a private practice clinic that specializes in the care of the LGBT plus community in Oklahoma, and it was previously the health equality coordinator and advanced practice nurse for OU Medicine. Diversity Family Health started as a small one-room clinic in Oklahoma City, responding to the need that LGBTQ plus people needed to receive quality care. And it has now had multiple clinics in Oklahoma available through franchises throughout the United States. Rusty is a master's prepared emergency clinical nurse specialist and nurse practitioner with over 30 years of experience in emergency care, hospital administration, and now primary and specialized care services for the LGBTQ community. Skilled in Lean Six Sigma and Studer principles, Russell specializes in coaching leaders in process and leadership change to increase quality and efficiency of care. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hear what Rusty has to say. I said it is on. Yes.
All right with it. Okay, very good. It's always a pleasure for me to come to Rose State because was it 2 decades ago, I started my nursing career right here at Rose State. So it's always great for me to come back and feel like I'm a part of leading other people at Rose State in their journey that may just beginning like mine was 20-something years ago. So again, my name is Russell Rooms, and I'm like she said, I'm a nurse practitioner, advanced practice nurse. Started this little company called Diversity Family Health about 3 years ago, really just to take care of a need that we noticed in the community, and really kind of started with the gender affirming hormone therapy for transgender individuals, because there was really a lack of that here in the city. We had a doctor that came down from Tulsa a couple times a week to take care of transgender patients, and so she has had her second retirement, and we now have a plethora of places that gender affirming hormone therapy can be received in the Oklahoma City area and the Tulsa area in the state of Oklahoma. So yes, a lot has happened in the recent years to provide great care. But what I'm going to talk about, one of the things I want to always, I got to point it this way. Okay, so one of the things I always want to start off with is kind of the 101 stuff, because I can't assume, number one, that everybody in the audience is either part of the LGBTQ family or is skilled in it. And then what we've also found is there are people that aren't part of the community that don't necessarily know parts of the other factions and the thoughts and visions and culture of the subculture. So who are LGBTQ people? I always say, if you know one LGBTQ person, you know one LGBTQ person, because we are not necessarily brought together by a common interest or a same language or a same culture. We're really brought together by the common challenges and discriminations that we have and the biases that we've talked about already. So why this alphabet soup, right? Why all these letters? It's, again, people just trying to find a way to be identified and have a label that they can assume and be identified by. So a number of things have been extended in our algorithm over the years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So some terms and definitions. One of the things I want to make sure everybody understands is that sexual orientation and gender identity are really two different concepts. They are not equal concepts. So we have those that are related to sexual orientation, like those that are straight or heterosexual, lesbian, gay or homosexual, bisexual, and queer that identify as that, or I say claim that label. Then we also have those that are, this clicker is going to kill us all tonight, cisgender, those that are cisgender, those that are transgender, non-binary, or intersex. And then the A, kind of at the end of the algorithm, for asexual, which kind of covers both, are those that are allies, and which would be people that really support people in the LGBTQ community, even though they may be cisgendered and heterosexual. It's tempting just to always point this way, isn't it? So there are several concepts within sexual orientation, It's how a person characterizes their physical and emotional attraction to others. And it has those three dimensions: their identity, their attraction, their behavior. But what sometimes happens is we don't understand that the behavior may not always relate to the identity or the attraction. Okay, somebody may claim the label of being heterosexual. They may have attraction to women, but their behaviors may not necessarily go in line with that. And the reason I say that is because as healthcare providers, that's important for you guys to understand, is that somebody comes into you, and if you were to have a field on your form that says sexual orientation, right, they're going to put straight on it, but it may not give you the whole story that they are maybe in a relationship, they're maybe married, but they have another man or a woman that comes into the relationship with them and their wife. Okay, so it may be as simple as that, or they may be closeted and not wanting to say anything about it. So the behaviors don't always necessarily align within their sexual orientation that or label or identity that they. The other thing, hopefully all healthcare people in here have seen this, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? What you need to keep in mind is right there on the bottom rung is sex, right? So that is one of the needs we have way below, way more than we do intimacy, and much more than love and belonging and esteem and self-attraction. So what we need to do as healthcare providers is check our own morality at the door and our own value systems at the door. No LGBTQ person is asking you to have the same behaviors and the same morals and the values that they have. And you know, I've been an emergency room nurse for over 20 years. And there were a number of people that rolled through my doors, I guess you should say, that I wasn't necessarily going to do the same behaviors that they did, but I still gave them great care and still met them where they were at and provided them care. So that's where, as healthcare professionals, it's important for us to be able to do that. Gender identity. So gender identity is a person's internal sense of being man, woman, or both, neither, or maybe some other gender. What's the T in LGBT? So transgender people have a gender identity really that's different than their birth sex. So that may be a trans man, trans woman, or sometimes we refer to them, or you may see them in documentation or literature as male to female or female to male. We have those that are gender queer, gender fluid, and like you mentioned in the Native American community, the two-spirit individual that has really the spirit of a woman and a spirit of a male inside of them. And the gender queer individuals, those that just feel like they're gender fluid. Because there's two ends of the spectrum, and many of the cisgendered people are on one end of that spectrum. But these non-binary gender queer people may float within that spectrum from a day-to-day basis. So again, cisgender is a term that you may not be familiar with, but that just means that the person currently identifies as the same gender as they were assigned at birth. So let's talk about stigma and discrimination. I'm not going to go back. Discrimination is common in the lives of LGBTQ people. Among LGBTQ people, 39% say they've been rejected by a family member or friend. We'll talk more about that in a minute. 30% threatened or physically attacked, 21% treated unfairly by an employer, and 30% of youth have missed a day of school in the last month because of this discrimination and bias, and they felt unsafe because of that. And among transgender people, 61% say they've been physically attacked, 55% have lost their jobs, they believe. And so in healthcare, we kind of see some things that are similar. LGBTQ patients report that their providers used excessive precautions or refused to touch them, especially in the HIV community. And this is not 10 years ago. This is last week that I've heard reports from a patient that when they went to the emergency department, they double glove on before they look in their ears. Okay, it's like you're not having sex with them, you're just looking in their ears, right? You're just looking at their tympanic membrane. You're not going to get HIV from that. And as healthcare providers, we need to know that. We need to understand that there are the ways that you can contract HIV and the ways that you can't. And if you are HIV positive and undetectable, you can't transmit the virus to anybody. So I always say I'd rather have different terms, but I would rather have relations with somebody who's positive and undetectable than somebody who doesn't know their HIV status, because that person is more likely to hurt me than person that is HIV positive and on treatment. They blame them for their health status. We see that within the infectious disease community in the state of Oklahoma, that the people who provide care will make the patients feel, whether they intended to or not, they make that patient feel like they've had some kind of responsibility, or because of their behavior, this is now some of the consequences that you're just going to have to live with. Use harsh or abusive language toward LGBTQ people. Transgender patients report being harassed in a doctor's office 25% of the time and being denied medical care, saying, we don't have transgender flu shots here, or the orthopedist doesn't treat transgender fractures. It's like, well, those are the same regardless of. So what happens with a person? The stigma, discrimination, and health. What happens is this stigma discrimination leads to this chronic and acute stress that the LGBTQ people are carrying with them all the time. A good lesbian friend of mine once when we were speaking together, she talked about, she was at this dinner party and for her work, and and she was having small talk. There was a little cocktail reception before the main dinner or whatever. And some people talking to them, and they said, "Well, what does your husband do?" So she said, "I have all the scenarios that could happen depending on my response, because if this person could be a potential customer for our company, and if they were that role, or could I meet this person as an employer in the future? How am I going to respond to this? Do I take the time to educate this individual, or do I make up something?" They said they're a nurse, right? So, and their spouse was a nurse. Anyway, so that's the kind of chronic stress, though, LGBTQ people take to the grocery store, take to the drive-through whenever they're driving through a McDonald's. Okay, so that's the kind of chronic stress that can impact their mental health, their physical health, access to care, as we've kind of already talked about, and access to competent care, right? Diversity. I talked about the growth of diversity family health, and she talked about the bio. And we started out with a little one-room clinic at the diversity center, and we outgrew that, and now we're even outgrowing the space that we're in now. Matter of fact, we're adding another. We started with me doing everything. I took the vital signs, I was in the lab, I did the registration, I had somebody help me with the billing stuff, but it started out as that based on that need that I recognize in the community, to where it's grown that now we have four nurse practitioners in the state, and about to add another 50. Because there's that much need in this community to have competent care, to have somebody, when you talk to them about what goes on in your life, you're not scared, and so you will talk about things that you really need to talk about, because they do affect your health, especially when we're talking about sexual health. Anyway, so access to competent care, so that leads to those health disparities and inequalities, starting off with that, the stigma and discrimination. Leads to homelessness, leads to HIV and sexually transmitted infections. Some of this is like, what comes first, the anxiety and depression, or the suicide attempts, or the addictions, or the smoking, all again based on that discrimination and bias that we live with daily. So I painted this pretty, and you did too, this grand picture of the LGBTQ community and all the stress and all the stuff that we have to deal with. But despite all these challenges that the LGBTQ people face, most of them live happy, healthy lives. They have a mortgage, they have great jobs, they have pictures on the wall in their house that just have two same-sex individuals on them and their kids, as opposed to a man and a woman. And suffer the same challenges that every other heterosexual and cisgender couple or individuals do as well. So most of them are living happy lives through the resilience. So what as healthcare providers we need to do is avoid assumptions. Okay, a key principle in effective communication is to avoid making assumptions. Like, don't assume you know a person's gender identity just by looking at them. Okay. Or the way they look and the way that they sound. Don't assume you know how a person wants to describe themselves or their partners. for the people that they come into your healthcare environment. Don't assume all the patients are heterosexual and cisgender and not possibly transgender. So again, we make assumptions based on the way people talk, the way people look. And so especially in healthcare, that's important that we don't let those assumptions keep us from making good decisions about the patients. And we just have to learn how to ask the right questions to everybody. So avoid making assumptions about gender identity or sexual orientation with new patients. Use gender neutral terms when you start out to avoid and avoid using pronouns. For example, instead of "How may I help you, sir?" And we're in the South, right? So I know I grew up, you call yes, sir, yes, ma'am, whatever. So I've had to learn to drop that because I may not know specifically how this person wants to be addressed. So just leaving the pronoun off of it. How may I help you? Instead of "she is here for appointment," maybe the patient is, here in the waiting room. Okay. So instead of "she's here for her appointment," the patient's here for their appointment. What the patient, what are your mother and father's names? Okay. Because they may have same-sex parents, right? So instead asking, what are your parents or guardians' names? Instead of, "Do you have a wife?" say, "Are you in a relationship?" or "Do you have a partner?" And so that way you avoid that anxiety that you can cause to your patient by them having to say, "Okay, do I school this person, or do I go along with it, or how often do this?" Okay, so you help alleviate that, and that's one of the most important things we can do in the healthcare setting is relieve the anxiety of the patient, right? Because then they will find medications, they will do whatever we ask them to do. If they'll be more forthright with the information if we decrease that anxiety. Using names and pronouns. Another key principle of effective communication is using the patient's preferred names and pronouns. Transgender people often change their name to affirm their gender identity, so we may have some discongruence sometimes. This name is sometimes different than what is on their insurance or identity documents, and that's sometimes a tough thing to monitor. And especially when we look at the fact that the majority of our patients that come in are going to gender, right? So we have to keep a thought in our head that, if there is some incongruence between the person's name that I see on this piece of paper and the cards that I have, we'll talk about some ways that we can ask that without being discriminatory or causing grief. Transgender people want others to use their pronouns to affirm their gender identity as well. So registration forms should have a space for patients to enter their preferred name and pronouns, okay? And somewhere in the medical record that can be communicated throughout the visit. A patient's pronouns and preferred name should be used consistently by all staff. Okay, that should be something from the leadership down, and that's what was great to do, to be the health equality coordinator of you, bringing them to be a leader in the health equality through the HRC. That was a great time that we were able to say, everybody's got to be on board with this. That it's not an option for you as a healthcare provider to say, "No, I'm not going to use that name," or "I'm not going to use that pronoun." So it's important for that to be modeled by leadership and held accountable by every staff member. It is important to use the patient's preferred pronouns. Most trans women prefer she or her, and most trans men prefer he or his. But some people don't like those pronouns necessarily, or especially when the non-binary individuals want to use something like they. And ask if you're unsure. That's what's so important, and is so, again, relieves that anxiety of a transgender individual. If you ask, how can I best affirm you? What pronouns can I use? We had at OU, the last year I was there, we delivered 3 babies from transgender men. Okay, and I was asked by the OB director to come over and prep the staff on, okay, how's the best way to take care of these transgender men that have gone up hormones long enough. They were the ones that in the relationship decided to bear the child. And so, one of the main things I told them is they know they're transgender, and they know you know they're transgender. So just get that elephant out of the room. You can say something like, we both know that you're not the typical patient that we take care of here. How can I best affirm you while you're here? And that right there, the anxiety that patient falls down, they know they're in a safe place because the provider has called out the elephant in the room and addressed it and is going to make them, shows the desire. And that's the other thing I tell healthcare providers too, is that transgender people have had people in their life refusing to affirm them, refusing to use their preferred name, refusing to use their preferred term. And so the best thing so you don't have to get a right on it, but you at least have to show that you're trying. If you accidentally get it wrong, just say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be disrespectful, and go on. Here are some of the pronouns that are used, subjective, objective. We're not doing necessarily an English lesson because I know we're short on time. Using names and pronouns, if you are unsure, just ask. I'd like to be respectful. So again, if you have some discongruency or you have some reason to believe that this person may be transgender, say, I'd like to be respectful. So what name and pronouns would you like me to use? Okay. If you've gotten it wrong and they're a cisgender person, they'll just look at you like, what? But the thing is, if you find that incongruence, like in paperwork or in IDs or those kind of things, that's a great way to again call it out and say, I just want to be respectful. So what would you like me to use? How can I best affirm you? If a patient's name doesn't match their insurance card, you can ask something like, could your chart be under a different name? Because we'll have actually, even at Diversity Family Health, we will have a name that their preferred name that comes up on their appointment, so we know what their preferred name is. But then when we look on the chart, because EMRs just have not gotten it yet, emergency medical or electronic medical records have not gotten it yet. Created great ways for us to capture all of that and use it. So we still have a legal name, or the name that's on their insurance card and driver's license system. And so we're like, okay, there's a difference here. So we sometimes have to say, could your chart or your insurance be under a different name, where they call up on the phone and they're using the preferred name, and we're needing to look them up in the system. What is the name? What's the name on your insurance? Asking those direct questions without being saying, well, are you transgender or something? If you accidentally use it wrong, again, just say, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be disrespectful. Avoid outdated terms when working with LGBTQ people, like homosexual. Use more terms like the gay, lesbian, bisexual, LGBTQ. Transvestite or transgendered are terms that are outdated and wrong. Using the word transgender when you're describing or referencing a person that is not cisgender. Sexual preferences and lifestyle choice. Again, for most gay people, they don't necessarily think of a choice. They think it was, that's the way they've always been. So it's what is their sexual orientation. So what about queer? Right, that's coming up a lot now. And I remember, being in high school. That was, you called me a queer, and that was just as bad as calling me a faggot. Okay, an increasing number of people, especially the youth, identify themselves as queer. So now it's really kind of a term of endearment, and it usually means having a sexual orientation that's something other than heterosexual. Although queer has traditionally been an insult, many use it now as a term of pride. Again, those older individuals that got that use thrown at them in a derogatory fashion don't really like it. Using identity terms, it's important to listen and understand and mirror the terms the patient used to describe themselves and their body parts. Okay, and that's especially say the transgender men. They don't like to have their top referred to as a breast or referred to as a chest. And that's one thing about the Diener. We're talking about chest meat. We're not talking about breast meat, because those things can trigger the dysphoria for the patient. Keep in mind that some people do not like to label their sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, so they don't accept labels or want that kind of label. They're individuals, they're human. What race are they? They're human race, right? All right, so I'm just going to briefly take a look at a study I did back in 2018 with OU. We were looking at trying to define the LGBTQ people in the state of Oklahoma. And what we found was that this is a group that does not want to be described, right? They want different labels and all that kind of stuff. So they were basically refusing to be described. But what they did tell us is what their top 10 disparities came out to be: mental health, access to healthcare, and bullying. So a lot of mental health stuff, right? Again, not at all related to their sexual orientation and gender identity. It's more related to the discrimination and bias and the results of that they were needing to flesh out. Interactions in healthcare, 38% said they were out to their PCP. Okay, and I can tell you, I was the health equality coordinator at OU Medical Center. So I was like the token gay guy running the show for the LGBTQ people there, and I had not talked to my physician about it. I told him that there's some things that probably we should have addressed in my health history that we haven't. Have never talked to their provider about their sexual health. 48% go to the doctor's office when seeking medical care. 30% have avoided healthcare because they couldn't afford it, and 11% said that they've avoided healthcare because of fear of discrimination and bias. And so what's really important is that healthcare providers, and especially if they're going to go on to advanced practice and those kind of things, is being able to open up that conversation with your patients somehow. I would say in doctor's offices, there should be, on that review assistance form where it asks you, have you had a cough, lost weight, blood in your urine, and everything else on that review assistance form that you put on there. Would you like to talk about your sexual health today? Or has your sexual practices changed since the last time since your last appointment? So again, they can check that, and that can help open up the conversation because they're there for their hypertension and diabetes or whatever. But those issues may also need to be addressed. So takeaways from the study was the LGBT community is not homogeneous. They are bound by, again, their common discrimination. We verified that. The terminology used within the groups is not well defined. What was also interesting, we were talking about sexual orientation. We have, especially a transgender, we have a transgender male that is married to a female. And so does this transgender male, do they identify as gay or straight? Right? And so that was what was interesting was that was all over the board with respondents of that. So again, that's for them to own and for them to identify. It may be different with every individual and what their attraction is to. A transgender male may be attracted to other men. They also may be attracted to females. So there's not consistency among the groups. Underserved is not necessarily uninsured, like I talked about. The majority of LGBTQ people have jobs and homes and go to college and those kind of things. That they're not just a bunch of people that are homeless and in need of community services. There's a large percentage of LGBTQ community in Oklahoma who do not have spiritual and religious ties. I could go on for another 3 or 4 slides about what we found out in that there. But as somebody who was rejected from the church because of the relationship I had with him. That's a real thing that people feel like the church is up and down with it, that it's discriminating against them. So barriers to healthcare, social discrimination, lack of cultural competent care, lack of people like you guys who will now know how to best care for this population. Health insurance was another one that was identified. So going to kind of wrap it down to talk about how you can really care for the LGBTQ people. First of all, the pain is real, okay? That feeling that you're uncomfortable in your own body and the dysphoria is real. Who you love is who you love, and having somebody try to take that away from you or tell you that you're wrong or tell your child that their dad's going to hell because he's gay. Those are just not that's painful. Gender identity and sexual orientation are at the core of every being. Okay, so that's why it's so painful. So the needs of the LGBTQ people, basically the same for the lesbian and gay individuals, having their partner or their wife at the bedside and included as part of the family. Okay, that's an important thing for us to say, oh, well, this is not a family member. It may be their chosen family and that is the person who does it. Those are what their decisions want to be. So they need to be at the bedside and be considered part of the family. Having both women considered parents or both individuals considered the parents for a child, not saying which one's the dad. Well, they're both the dad. And most of the times you don't need to know, but if there was a genetic disease or something you're trying to look for, and you want to know who the biological parent is, or either who is biologically related, or both of you, or either one of you biologically related. And we preface that with, because it's important for us to know to better care for your child. I need to know either one of you are biologically related. But outside of genetic diseases, we most commonly don't need to know. Removing assumptions about family planning for the men and the women. Okay, some people, and everybody's kind of different on this. When I talk to the healthcare provider, some people think, well, they're lesbians, so why would they want a kid? You know, and other people are like, well, they're females, of course. And they do the same for men. Well, they're men, so you know, why would they want a kid? Maybe a father. The trans men, trans women, queer and intersex, being treated in their innate sexual identity is what's most important to them, and being addressed by their preferred pronouns and names is also important to them. So all in this community have faced the rejection and discrimination, and may have mental health needs that are not part of why they're there. So we need to remember that discrimination and bias is always covering for the other mental health issues that go along with that, may be part of the reason that they're there. Use open-ended questions and inclusive language, like what is your relationship status, as opposed to saying do you have a wife or do you have a husband. Not using Mr., Mrs., or Ms., like I said, sir or ma'am. Calling out in the waiting room, when you call in the waiting room, calling out like the last name, as opposed to calling out whatever the first name is on the insurance or whatever. So if you routinely are just calling out the last name, then most commonly you'll get that right. Using preferred names, maybe a nickname or a more just gender specific name. So when I have on that form, you know, what's your preferred name? I put Rusty, right? So that's something that other people can use, cisgender people can use as well. Ensure questions, exams are related to the health information and not curiosity. If they come in for that ear infection, you don't need to look at transgender person's genitals, just because of your own curiosity. Okay. But that is done. That is done. And is wrong. Preface the reason you're asking questions. Yeah. Preface the reason that you're asking questions, like to best advise you on your health strategies. I would like to ask you some questions about your sexual behaviors, and I ask these to all of my patients. Again, you're kind of clearing the base and say, you know, I ask this of all the patients, so I'm not calling you out because you came in and you know you look like you're loafers. I just need to ask you about your sexual practices for your health, so I can best care for you. Is there anything else I need to know that would ensure that we get the most out of the visit? So you're opening that up so they can say, well, you know, I want to talk to you because I have this sore down here, or I have, you know, this has been bleeding, or, you know, whenever I have sex, I, you know, blah, blah. So having that question that can say, is there anything else that we need to talk about today? So if there's something that's in their mind, hopefully by this time you reduce their anxiety enough, they felt that they can trust you, comfortable enough where they can do that. Avoid reaction or pause after a patient shares some information, because you know I've said before that you know I've heard it all. You know, in my practice, there's nothing even surprising. I've said that I was like talking, and 3 days later somebody walked in and told me what they're doing at the pool noodle, and I was like, I hadn't heard this. But I said, okay, well, let's take a look at this. They're one and done. They're not clean. They're too porous. Stuff can get in there. Disease can get in there. So yeah, so one and done. They're cheap. Get another full noodle. That's how I can help you as a healthcare provider and keep you safer and free of disease. Be prepared. So be prepared with. You know, thank you for being so open with me. Again, that still reinforces that trust that you have. Reflect patient's language and avoid assumptions. So how patients refer to themselves, how patients refer to their body parts, how patients refer to those people that are with them, reflect that same language. Am I done? Was that cutting me off? Let's see, I just have a few more slides. I know everybody will stay through the panel. Yeah. Was that the hook? Was that the traditional hook? There we go. Oh. right? Yep, there. Okay, let's go here. Apologize when you get it wrong again and make every effort to correct it. And the other thing, like I talked about, hold others accountable for not participating in dehumanizing behavior. Trafficking, I wanted to bring this up to you, especially because of the LGBTQ. They many times are rejected by their church, they're rejected by their parents, they're thrown out of their homes, and they are perfect fodder for traffickers, okay? They will capitalize on that vulnerability, and they will supply them with the love that they're not getting from their parents. They will supply them with safety, supply them with drugs, supply them with acceptance, and all you got to do is 10 blowjobs an hour. Right? And so it's important for us to keep in mind what's happening to our youth and trying to identify that if you see them in the healthcare. So my slogan is you don't have to understand it, you just have to care. As a healthcare provider, you don't have to understand it, you don't have to subscribe to whatever they're doing, you don't have to bring it into your home and your life, but all you need to do as a healthcare provider is care. I had a mother out of Edmond Pride walk up to me and take care of their son, their transgender son, and they said, you know, one of the best things that you ever said to me in our first little initial consultation was, you don't have to understand, you just have to care. She said, I use that with family members over and over. That, you know what? I'm going to love this kid. I don't have to understand it. Who understands a teenager, right? Who understands the behavior of a teenager, right? You don't have to understand it. You just have to care and love them anyway, right? So in conclusion, get to know your patients as a person, okay? So they're not just LGBTQ, they've got jobs, they've got pets, they've got trips that they're going on. So you know, find out about them as a person and use that as your way to ease their anxiety and gain their trust. Use inclusive and neutral language. Do you have a wife, husband, or boyfriend? I've already talked about that. Listen to how people describe their own body parts. Ask them, how can I best affirm you to your sexual orientation or gender identity? Each individual is unique. If you know one LGBTQ person again, remember you know one LGBTQ person. Because sometimes, you know, because of media, right? It's the main thing that develops our bias, whether it be on race or sexual orientation, gender, or anything else. The media will portray certain groups as a certain lifestyle. But again, like I said, the majority of them are not in the bars doing drugs, having as much sex as they can possibly have. The majority of them are have mortgages and kids and problems with cisgender heterosexual folks. So in summary, know your biases. Okay, that's the biggest thing. You need to be able to identify what your biases are and how they're affecting the way you care for all your patients. Be respectful. Put this knowledge you have now into play and into your practice. And remember that as a healthcare provider, you carry a level of authority with as oppressed and disenfranchised patients. Okay, so use that for good and be positive. Okay. Any questions? All right, we do not have time for questions. So I will be back at that table. Do I have any questions or want to? Yeah, let's open up for, we have what, 20 minutes for questions? We have information back there where you can get a hold of me, as well as if you have any questions or have any resources that we can provide for you. So thank you all for.
Right. I've got a funny story to share about Rusty and myself. So Rusty and I are both in the same doctoral program, at Oklahoma City University. And at the beginning of the semester, I'm a travel nurse. So I was up in Rhode Island and I had to zoom in for our course. And for this specific course, we were talking about some of our ideas that we wanted to implement for our practicum hours, and thus this training was born. With this course and this training, we got to hear about everyone's ideas, and Rusty shared his as well as several others. And I was so excited to hear about how many fellow students had these wonderful ideas regarding the LGBT community. So I start to think about what I wanted to do for my project, and this is just an idea in the back of my mind. And I come across diversity family health on the internet as I'm doing some research, and I thought, oh my gosh, a nurse practitioner who can talk about these things. I'm going to reach out to him. So I reach out to him and we set up a Zoom call, and we're about a third of the way through the Zoom call before I don't realize, but Rusty points out to me that we're actually in the same class and we have met and we've had this interaction before. So that's just a funny story that I had to share. And I'm so glad that he was able to come tonight and share in his wealth of knowledge. So we will go ahead and move on. We've got about 30 minutes or so to introduce our panelists and hear all of the wonderful things that they have to share. So tonight we have 4 panelists on, and I will introduce each of them individually before we just have a little chat. So the first one being is Kelley Blair. And Kelley Blair is pronouns of they, them, and their, earned a master's degree in community counseling at Oklahoma State University, Stillwater. Kelley is a licensed professional counselor and supervisor with over 20 years of experience working in the helping field with therapeutic and advocacy experience related directly to the Native American and LGBTQ communities in Oklahoma. Kelley is Choctaw, Cherokee, and Seminole, and they also identify as transgender two-spirit or gender nonconforming. Kelley is the founder of Diversity Center of Oklahoma, which is a nonprofit community resource center for gender diverse and two-spirit LGBTQ plus populations and their families. Kelley has extensive experience working in the nonprofit arena and serves several Native American and LGBTQ related nonprofit boards, social justice, state and civic community organizations, and currently they co-chair the Central Oklahoma Two-Spirit Society and sit on the International Council of Two-Spirit Societies. So Kelley's a pretty busy individual. So we'll go ahead and give Kelley a round of applause as she heads up. Next, we have Dr. Elizabeth Diener. Dr. Elizabeth Diener has taught in programs of nursing for the past 28 years in New York, Missouri, and Oklahoma. Dr. Diener currently serves as a professor of nursing at Oklahoma City University's Kramer School of Nursing. Liz is trained as a Caritas coach in Watson's Caring Science Institute, holds a certificate as a soul collage facilitator, and is a certified forest therapy guide, as well as a level 1 teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction or MBSR meditation. Her clinical practice areas have included pediatrics AIDS care, neonatal intensive care, pediatric emergency care, ECMO, hospice and palliative care, and nursing leadership and administration. Humility, respect, and kindness are characteristics that she values most in friends and colleagues. It's Dr. Elizabeth Diener. Next, we have Saturn Reneau. Saturn is a freshman cybersecurity major at Rose State College. Saturn identifies as non-binary and as asexual. Saturn is the treasurer for the Spectrum Alliance this year and is also a part of the president's leadership class at Rose State College. Saturn. And last but certainly not least, we have Miss Kendall Walton. Kendall is a soon-to-be graduate of Rose State College in the Mass Communications and Journalism program. Kendall is the assistant editor of the 15th Street News and the 6420 magazine. She is the president of the Rose State College Spectrum Alliance and has received the Rose State College Leadership Scholarship. She soon plans to attend UCO in this coming year, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say for us. Kendall, everyone. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started for the sake of time. So this panel is open for any of our lovely panelists to answer as they would like to do so. But my first question tonight is, overall, what are some of your general thoughts about the state of LGBTQ plus health education from either the perspective of a provider or as a patient? Yeah, whoever would like to.
I think there's a lot of ignorance and bias still in today's healthcare. I feel like people don't want to take the time out of their day to educate themselves. Very grateful for you being here, taking this time to learn these lessons and learn these principles and values. because there's not a lot of people who are willing to do that. We get so caught up in our lives, they're willing to just go to work, go home, and not understand, like Russell said, you know, or Rusty, sorry, you may not understand it, but your job is to care. I need to feel like you care. I need to feel safe with you, because some of the things we are going to talk about might be cringeworthy. It might be important. They might make me really nervous because I haven't been able to express this to my partner or to my family. And so you are kind of like as journalists, we have to remain unbiased in our stories, and I feel like that's very important out there.
Absolutely.
First, I just have to thank you all for being out tonight. It's really important to all of us to be able to express this to the world. Secondly, I'd like to speak not only as a patient, but also as a student myself. As you all know, sex education is a topic that is taught in public schools, but also oftentimes does exclude people of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think that is a fundamental part of why a lot of times people in the community are overlooked in these areas. And I think that a good place to start would be at that fundamental level, so that people of all ages understand that we are an important part of healthcare, and that families are often different and different from people who are cisgender and are heterosexual.
Like to point out is that educating healthcare providers, healthcare professionals, still this sort of elephant in the room. It's not done well. It's not something you're going to test for on licensing exam, and pretty much in order to pass in what it will be tested on, we have a tendency to push all topics out. And this is, you know, goes into everything, but how do you get there? How do you spend time? Both as provider and also as a receiver of care. Questions. How do I know if someone's going to do exactly what I have to say that I can share? And how, as a nurse, how do I want that to offend someone by introducing a topic? They are, but I kind of suspected, or they really didn't want to write this. And of course, Rusty had a perfect thing in there. But it leaves you, or at least it leaves me, with this feeling that we've gotten off on the wrong foot, and I have to build a relationship. So it's something we need to discuss in just these kind of forums, and to get some dialogue going between patients and providers. So.
Yeah, one of the things, one of the reasons why the Diversity Center came about was by providing a symposium, to teach cisgender and heterosexual behavioral health clinicians to be more culturally sensitive to providing services to our community. Because there's a lack of formal education related to providing services. And so it makes me think of what they're doing here tonight is providing this forum. That's how we're still providing education to students in their settings. Still providing these extra opportunities because there isn't rural training in healthcare. I don't know how many times Russell and I have been asked to come to nursing or other places to provide this extra opportunity for students because there isn't classes specifically to provide training for healthcare providers, like LGBT care. We're on advisory boards at universities related to medical care in training. But there still isn't that formal education, those classes specific for.
I try not to speak during this part because, like I said, there's so much knowledge to be shared from all of these individuals. But that is a big reason why something like this needs to occur, because you say that you and Rusty have both been called to answer this need for this education. But at the end of the day, this responsibility doesn't lie on you, right? This should be a part of the generalized curriculum. So, excellent point. So for my next question for our panelists, what are some of the biggest barriers that you have faced when attempting to access healthcare services?
One of the biggest things I have faced is assumptions, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. It just depends on the situation, really. But I would have to say the biggest thing is assumptions. Recently with COVID, for instance, we all have to wear these masks and it covers up a lot of us. I went to the emergency room for something I can't even remember. This was before I became a patient at Russell's Clinic. Great place. I feel completely safe there with everybody. But anyway, I was at the hospital and the lady came in and she asked me, when was the last time I had a pap smear? And I told her, I was like, I've never had one. And she was like, oh, well, we should get your information on that. You're 32 years old. There's no reason you shouldn't have had a pap smear by now. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. It was just kind of funny, but kind of awkward at the same time to me. I was like, well, if you want to bring me information, I'll take it. I can't do much with it, but thank you. And I guess in that time while she was gone, she flipped over my file and saw some notes in there and came back and was like, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. And I was like, it's no big deal. I'd rather you apologize and just drop it than continue this. How you see people continuously apologize over and over and make this big spectacle out of it, that gets very uncomfortable for me personally. So she apologized, we dropped it, moved on. And then she proceeded to keep putting her foot in her mouth by asking me, like, who did your surgery? Who did all your surgeries? You look wonderful. I would have never known. And I was just sitting there thinking the whole time, like, I've never had a surgery except dental work. Like, that's cool. And it was just really uncomfortable. So assumptions like that just make it hard to navigate sometimes. Because sometimes it's funny in those situations, and there's a lot of worse situations that I've been in that I won't describe. And so it's just really hard sometimes navigating those. And we don't want to tell you how to do your job. We just want appropriate care.
Similarly to what Kendall said, as someone who is asexual and as someone who does go to an OBGYN, assumptions are things that, especially about my own sexual behavior, that can potentially be very adverse in terms of my care. I recall in a former case, I went in for an OBGYN appointment, and I first started going to an OBGYN when I was 12 or 13 for just medical issues. And of course, they always ask the question, are you sexually active? And I would say no, and it was just time to dismiss. However, as I became older and I became around 16 or 17, I started to get weird looks or even smirks from my OBGYN or the nurse practitioner, whoever I was seeing. And to the point where I was even asked, are you sure? Because my mom was in the room, they rarely ever asked her to leave, but I was fine with her saying I wasn't. Like I said, I'm asexual. I don't experience sexual attraction, and therefore I don't really have an action in that way. And in the more extreme case, I had a major surgery a couple of years ago, and of course, they asked the same question, is actually pregnant. That was a potential risk, and I said no. And they kept badgering me about it, and having to go pregnant, like they had a pregnancy test and then actually blood draw, because my mom insisted there's no way at all that she goes home. Everything else, they refused to take my word for it because, and I believe it was based upon my age and the behavior they expected me as a teenager, that it just was so invalidated. Like they didn't value my word, that they basically just thought I was a liar. So I remember they just would have went and said, we're going to go and take the test as a precaution. Nothing personal, like nothing against your word, but just because we want to ensure your safety, instead of backing me over, I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure? That was far more offensive to me personally.
I would like to add, kind of on what Russell said about the HIV idea and how people double blood and take extra precautions even when living in 6 months a year. When I lived in Seattle 2 years ago, I was attacked and raped. And the more concern the doctor had was if I had HIV and was spreading it rather than what was actually happening in the situation. They were more concerned on the precautions they needed to take. If I gave it to my rapist, and it was just a very inappropriate time for that type of care. When I got moved on to a gastroenterologist, I can't say that word, I apologize. They made things very easy for me to the point that we created a relationship and I still talk to her. I sent her flowers after I healed and stuff because I will never forget that lady for as long as I live. And she just took those steps to not assume, but rather listen to me and figure out what was the problem, what was going on, and help me fix it.
Well, from my perspective, it's also assumption, so you see a trend here. But it has to do with age and ageism, because there's this sort of mindset that somehow, and I'm going to call it globally, a gay lifestyle has to do with people who are young, or, there's an age cutoff, probably I'm just going to throw out 40. But definitely when you get up to my age, people aren't thinking, that I could have a gay identity. And so nothing in my healthcare ever focuses on that, ever asks. And assumptions are made that the person who accompanied me must be my sister. And just things all along that. So the questions that Rusty was giving about, ask about family, ask about relationships, ask about how they want to be called. And be sensitive to the language used, because if you're talking to me, I will say I have a spouse, okay? And I've had people, well-meaning people, who say, oh, your wife, and keep it, even though, and it's like early in the conversation, and so I'll be talking and I'll keep saying spouse, and they don't pick up on it, and they keep saying wife. Does your wife like this? Does your wife do that? And after a while, it's really irritating, And I can remember one time when I was spending an extended period of time with a healthcare provider, I finally said, no one would ever call her a wife, and I don't know how they took it, but it was like, that isn't her identity, and so be careful, be really sensitive to what is being said on language that patients give you about their relationships and their own.
Yeah, I was going to say stereotyping is really damaging to people that you work with. It really can prevent them from coming back for follow-up care. Folks that then you have surgery. I'm thinking of when we first started university and clinic there, the medical clinic, and they had surgery and they never came for any follow-up care until and they ended up having severe complications from their surgery. And because they were afraid to come in, they have having some major problems like infection and things like that, and they avoided treatment for a long time. And so if you think about that, some people will avoid coming in if they don't get the response that they're looking for.
They just keep answering my next questions. So my next one to follow up on that, Dr. Bachhofer's presentation spanned several hundreds of years worth of information. So for those of you who maybe have this experience, what generational trends have you seen when working with healthcare providers, perhaps someone who is younger and perhaps a younger medical professional versus care that you received from someone maybe 5-10 years ago? Has there been much of a change?
I'm going to say yes, but I don't know necessarily if it's a generational thing in my situation. I'm gonna say like it was when I started transitioning, the first doctor I saw was cisgender, heterosexual, and quite honestly ignorant to how hormones and the process works, and the process was entirely terrible to start. And when I started branching out, I found members of my community and started seeking treatment with them. I felt safe and they knew what they were doing. And that's kind of where I saw more care, more empathy, I guess, rather than just someone at Planned Parenthood that was just trying to get me in and out for their next appointment.
I think we, as professionals too, we don't gatekeep like we used to. And when I say gatekeep, like for hormone treatment, even surgery, we're used to, trans folks would have to have a letter from a therapist to be able to start on hormone treatment. And now, it's been several years now that we don't have. But we used to, sometimes folks would have to wait a certain period of time and have therapy treatment before they can get hormone treatment. And that's not the case. And it made it really difficult for even people who identify as a trans person themselves. And we felt like that was a part of the process. And so we even gatekeep which is hard. But that was according to WPATH standards, and now we don't even, there's not even letters required for some surgeries or requirement for therapy for those surgeries either. And so that makes things so much easier for our community to access. Change that just a bit and say, rather than, although you could tie it to generational issues, it's more regional issues. I know that when I've lived in the Midwest and now in the South Central portion of the country, that these are very faith-based, a very faith-based region that I didn't encounter this as much as I'm going to say is that as a nurse, it have seen people struggle with how to be kind and respectful, accepting patients who really have this sort of say barrier, but have this conflict with what I've been taught my whole life as a person of faith, and to accept them means somehow I'm not meeting and I'm not as good. I'm going to use Christian, but it goes well beyond the Christian faith as well. It could also be I'm not as good a Muslim. If I can accept and treat these people, that are in my care who don't identify with what my faith says is wrong, and that that is, I think, the hardest conflict. If I had to give one message with this, it's that kindness and respect do not harm whatever your beliefs are in other parts of your life. And that certain professions, you've taken this on, that I will care regardless of how you present yourself and what who you are, what you hold in your truth. And I think that's, to me, that's the kind of most, the thing I struggle with the most, to come back to that feeling of respect. Treat each person just out of the basic humanity does not, should not conflict with the values.
My name is Avalon. As someone who was born in 2003, I can't say I have a lot of experience with multiple primary care physicians, but I can speak from the perspective of someone who grew up in the position, especially around the time period, as was stated earlier by one of our previous speakers, was a time period of a lot of change in social perception of acceptance of equal rights for people in our community. And I remember just around the same time I was starting to figure out myself and what my feelings and what for myself personally was the same around the same time that I started noticing in those well child checks and the pediatrician's office that there were starting to be like options for sexuality, and it wasn't super encompassing. It was pretty much gay, straight, bisexual, but just the fact that they had the thought and foresight to put that on there was something that was a great source of comfort. So that this was a safe place that they consider as to get involved in that side of care. And it like practically made me giddy and how way to grow. And because we just like to get giddy in that way more. So, but it's just something that was such a top one, even just little acknowledgements, I think, and how we've started to grow. We certainly do have a long way to go. I still feel like hope there absolutely, but just the fact that we're starting to take these steps to try to abolish these people and ourselves in the community, it's become more accepting of them and their needs. That's something that is.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to pick on Kelley for a second. So Kelley, can you tell us a little bit more about your work at the Diversity Center of Oklahoma? If I could have made this panel last all day long, I would have, but I'd like to hear just a little bit more from you specifically.
So Diversity Center of Oklahoma has really evolved and changed over the years. When we first started, Russell was there when we first started. We're kind of like an umbrella organization, community resource center. We provide behavioral health services, linkage to healthcare. We have Oklahoma Homeless Alliance there, and they provide housing for people who live positive. We also have Guiding Right, which is HIV and STI testing facility, and so they do rapid testing for our community. They also have other programs as well, like smoking cessation program, they have a farmers market program at their other locations. And so those services are free, testing services are free. We also partner with State Department of Health, and so they come out and they do testing, they do vaccines at our clinic. And we just had our first major grant, which is the program for intimate partner violence. So we got our certification through the Attorney General's office, so we're extremely excited about that. So there's a lot of things that go on at the diversity center.
We need some more organizations like that so we can kind of spread the love, right?
Like the Equality Center, but a little
Yeah.
smaller. We haven't been around as long as the Equality Center. We partner with services that we can. And if there are things that the community is interested in doing, or that they feel like there's a need, to have people contact them. Say, hey, this or that.
Wonderful. Well, just for the sake of time, I have one more question myself before maybe we open up to the audience. But as a nursing instructor, a couple weeks ago, I had a group of students who I was presenting just a short presentation to about some clinical considerations when caring for LGBTQ plus patients. And I said, okay, when you think about the care of the LGBT patient, what comes to mind? And, we've talked about a whole slew of things that, go into caring for the LGBT plus patient. However, most of those answers were focused upon STDs and drug use and different stigmas associated with this community. And that was, well, one side of me is thinking, yes, we need to be well versed in these issues and know what to expect with some of our patients. All of these have such negative connotations, right? Why are we not talking about the primary care services and all of the things that especially Rusty outlined in his presentation? So with that being said, what is maybe some practical advice that you would give to the up and coming health sciences professional, just whether it be from your own personal experience as a healthcare provider or as a patient, to maybe help break down some of those behaviors and stigmas?
Just to repeat what everybody's already said, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Like, let's just get it over with and move on. Because again, I am going to trust you. You're going to prescribe me medicine and maybe a surgery or whatever, and I'm going to need to trust you if we're going to move forward. Otherwise, I'm going to have to find a different provider. And so let's just talk about the elephant in the room. Ask me any questions. I sometimes catch me about it. I don't like being a walking Google, but most of the time I recognize that as my position in this life, and I'm going to educate as many people as I can. And so ask me questions. Some days you might even catch them an extremely extroverted day, and I will talk your ear off about way too much personal stuff. So let's just ask me what you feel you need to do. Let's move on and just be sympathetic and caring.
I would say that it's important to remember and internalize the fact that whenever you have a person that is a well-rounded human being person, that the fact that they are part of this community doesn't immediately make their issue a medical issue or concern specific to their sexual health or to HIV/AIDS. And not to prioritize that is what they come to me for. I gave the example earlier was if someone was in for ear infection, you don't be looking at their ear unless they tell you otherwise. And that's absolutely true. That is the service of care that they have come to me for, and to recognize that this is more than just someone who's gay. This is someone who has a career, who has a family at home, probably, again, has a bonus, advantage, maybe even 2.5 kids, and is just trying to live their life the best that they can, and they're relying on that care service to help keep living that life the best that they can. I would take advantage of opportunities like this, where you're able to ask questions. It's not offensive to ask. If you are able to go to a community center like center or other organizations that are LGBT friendly and doing workshops, that's the appropriate time to ask questions, because we assume that your intent is really good and asking those questions to learn. Don't encourage people to use our process because sometimes that's but if you're working with a that identifies that opportunity to ask questions with them, Russell or someone like that, that I feel. So I would typically those opportunities. That way you'll be more sensitive to the people that you're trying to serve.
Wonderful. Is there anything else to add?
I think that
Oh, yeah.
probably what I would say is practice from your heart. And as all panel members have pointed out, that we're there for certain things. All humanity does practice from your heart. You really can't go wrong practicing from your heart. Gosh, I didn't mean to be disrespectful. That's wrong for me. If it's me, just be open.
So how many people are administrators here? Anybody? I mean,
The table in the
it's a big
back.
Decision. So my biggest question is in journalism, like when I go to UCO, I'm enrolled in gay, lesbian, and film and media. Why are there not courses like that is part of the curriculum? That's the biggest question right now. Why are these volunteer opportunities and conferences and all these discussion panels, why is it not part, maybe not part of the course, it could be an elective, but let's make those steps to get it into the curriculum and into the education, because not only are you gonna wanna have people that are curious and wanna know, but you also have people like me, a part of the community, that wants to help their community. That's why I'm taking my gay and lesbian and film and media. I wanna know the history, I wanna know where we're going, I wanna know the trajectory. And so just even getting that class started is a huge, huge thing. That's all.
You're speaking my dream.
I will say you obviously know you have faculty and administrators and all kinds of.
Yes.
And so they have a
And that wasn't a jab at y'all. And I apologize. I was just saying, like, to the people that could make the decisions and stuff like that. So, no, I have mad love and respect for all of y'all. Y'all know this. No ill will, sorry. Spot right there.
Oh, excellent point. Okay, I think with that being said, in our last few minutes, if anyone has any questions for the panelists, if they're willing to answer.
So I'm wondering, of course, lots of information for all these psychologists, but I'm wondering if you see, a lot of tests for what about, how does that intersect for like racial and ethnic minorities? Identify with, so I'm wondering, I don't know, if there's, hesitation to access to services, just based on that those.
I mean, you can look at the numbers of the trans community. A lot of people that are victims and that die or murdered or suicide. I mean, there's lots of explanations are typically going to lean heavier into people of color. And that's one of the things with COVID that I personally want to research is because our Trans Day of Remembrance is coming up December 1st in this building section we'll be putting on our presentation. And I'm looking at the numbers of compared to before COVID, how it was making suicide and murder, as to now, how much impact has COVID had on this community because of the fear of going to the doctor or not having that accessible care or being homeless. I think one of the greatest shows out there that explains, especially the transgender community and people of color in the queer community, is Pose. It's very campy at times, but it also has some very realistic points in it that talk about the 80s and the 90s and the HIV movement and how we got to where we are. And so I think there does need to be a more focus on those underprivileged communities. I think they need to have the same opportunities as anybody else. Maybe it's not more.
What the ratio of
Mhm. Absolutely. For our individuals who will be listening to the recording after the fact, there was a question raised about the racial disparities among the LGBT plus population. And Rusty had a wonderful answer about how, as healthcare providers, it's very important for us to know the statistics so that we can provide, whether it be primary care services or something that's catered more towards their sexual health, whatever that may be, we can anticipate those challenges. Any other questions? Okay. It's late on a Thursday night, so I won't take up too much more of your time, but can we get a round of applause for all of these wonderful panelists for sharing? I know it takes a lot of courage just on my end to get up here and moderate a panel, let alone talk about my experience within healthcare or as a patient or provider. So this is just my reminder to all of you. This is, of course, something that I'm passionate about, but it's something that you all are as well to an extent, because you showed up here tonight to learn and to be better as a healthcare provider or as a student who will eventually be taking care of these patients. So especially at these times with everything that's going on in our state and in our country right now, this is something to be loud about. So just once again, the courage that was displayed up here tonight is an excellent example. And I encourage all of you to take some of that energy and go forth and be loud about this because it matters. Okay, so with that being said, I believe I have several copies of the different resources sheets that are laminated on the table. So you all are welcome to take any of those if you didn't have the chance to scan. Otherwise, the smaller QR codes have a training evaluation. And personally, that would mean a lot to me if you would take a few minutes to fill that out. But I appreciate you all being here tonight. And I hope to continue to see such a wonderful turnout at some of these training events.